My introduction to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature was when I was a law student and I was studying which organizations were working on conservation law and the international law for nature. I found that IUCN had been founded in 1948 and in its statutes the founders had determined there was no adequate international law for nature and this organization would undertake to help create it. I first met the IUCN law program in 1972. I was leading the Sierra Club's delegation to the 1972 Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment, the first United Nations conference ever on this theme. And there in Stockholm, I met Dr. Wolfgang Berheny, and who was the chair of what was then the Commission on Environmental Legislation of IUCN, which was a forerunner to the Commission on Environmental Law. And I met the head of the Environmental Law Center, Dr. Françoise Berheny-Guillemin, who was also Wolfgang's wife. She had come as a young lawyer to work and start the Environmental Law Center, which had only been going for about 6 years at that time. The commission itself was rather small. It consisted of about 30 people. But some of them were the most formidable thinkers about nature that you can imagine. People like Cyril de Clem, who conceived of ways to merge biology and law and help develop the theories for things like the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species, which IUCN was to sponsor in Washington, D.C. in 1973, the year after Stockholm. Wolfgang invited me to join the commission. It was a great honor to join the commission. And I began working as a North American member of the commission to cultivate systems that could build up environmental law around the world. I had the next year, in 1974, been appointed to the American delegations to work with the Soviet Union under détente, the theory of avoiding nuclear holocaust by getting to know each other better. And there was an agreement for cooperation in the field of environmental protection. So I began commuting to Moscow as the public delegate, that means the non-governmental delegate to the American delegations, as an expert in what was to become the field of environmental law. I had also been named to the Legal Advisory Committee of the President's Council on Environmental Quality, and was working on developing the first rules to implement the environmental impact assessment process in the United States, a process that was quickly transferred to Europe. Both France and the Netherlands developed environmental impact assessment procedures, and this idea became a very important legal concept. But it was through working with my Russian colleagues that I got to know Oleg Kolbasov, who became the vice chairman of the Commission on Environmental Law, the father of environmental law in Russia and the Soviet Union. I got to know a number of other specialists like Alexander Kiss, who was a great human rights lawyer and professor, and had also taken up this new challenge of environmental law. We began to work in the early 80s on developing a world charter for nature. IUCN formed a small drafting group. We had about 8 people, and we began to look at the different instruments, national, legislative, and constitutional instruments that called for the protection of nature. And we put together a draft world charter for nature. There had never been such a declaration of what are the rights and obligations of states or individuals toward nature. That draft was given to the United Nations Environment Program, which had been created at the Stockholm Conference. The Stockholm Conference achieved a number of first steps toward an international system of environmental law. And one was to have an agency, which was to be headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya, which would build up the understanding of environmental law, monitor environmental trends, and report back to nations what the problems of the global environment were, as well as work in capacity building with developing countries. This was a parallel mission when it came to law with that which the IUCN Commission on Environmental Law had been developing in IUCN. So we sent the World Charter to Nature to the Governing Council of the UNEP, the UN Environment Program. which then circulated it to the UN member states for comment. The comments were tabulated and revised. Text was then resent to the members with the cooperation of IUCN and ultimately referred to the United Nations General Assembly for adoption. When this declaration was adopted in the mid-1980s, it was quite a remarkable instrument because for the first time we had norms that put the intrinsic value of nature as a high obligation for states to protect. Wolfgang Berhenny's leadership in this was absolutely critical. We then used those norms, and this again I think is the brilliance of what Cyril de Clem and Françoise Berhenny-Gilman had, to draft a new draft convention on biological diversity. When the Law Commission took that convention to the IUCN Congress in Costa Rica, the World Conservation Congress was originally called the General Assembly of IUCN. The scientists, the others who were there, even my colleagues in the Sierra Club, wondered why were we talking about biodiversity? It's too complicated. The words are too big. You can never get a law on biodiversity. But the Commission persisted, and we got the endorsement of the General Assembly of IUCN, and ultimately transferred that instrument to the General Assembly of the UN, which formed an international negotiating committee in 1990 to work on this convention. This was, I think, this kind of activity that I was engaged in at this time was absolutely critical for the development of the law of nature. I had been involved also at that time as a vice chair from North America in the early steering committees, and it was in Perth, Australia, that at the General Assembly of IUCN, that I met Dr. Parvez Hassan. Wolfgang Berhenny had introduced Parvez as a successor candidate to him to run for election to the chairmanship of the Commission on Environmental Law. Parvez very graciously reached out to me and urged that I should become his deputy. And the deputy was different than the regional vice chairs because the deputy had to do all the work that the chair needed to have done in those days, as well as serve as the vice chair from the region where the deputy was chosen. I began working assiduously with Parvez, who was a great leader. He was a wonderful constitutional lawyer in Pakistan, and indeed he had won the very important Supreme Court ruling in Pakistan that established the right to the environment under the Constitution of Pakistan. So it was a great honor to work with him. We found that we both agreed on many of the initiatives in environmental law that were needed. I had been working in the 1980s also through the Sierra Club and IUCN in helping build the United Nations Law of the Sea Convention, and in particular Article 12, which was the first time we had an environmental law of the sea. And we knew that we had to feed that into the codification process for the World Charter for Nature. So under Parvez's leadership, we formed a drafting committee of about 30 people to develop the the International Draft Covenant on Environment and Development, a parallel way of implementing the World Charter for Nature and a way to codify many of the gains that were to be made in 1992 at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, the UN Conference on Environment and Development. During this time also, Parvez had enlisted me in an academic venture. He had been able to win the support of the Asian Development Bank and the National University of Singapore to provide a home in Asia for developing the teaching of environmental law in Asia and the Pacific. At that time, environmental law was not taught anywhere in this region in any of the law schools, and we knew that the growing body of international environmental law had to be transmitted to younger lawyers, had to be inculcated into the agencies and the national legal systems of the region, and we had to create a model for, in fact, what should the curriculum in environmental law be worldwide. It was beginning to be taught fairly universally in Western Europe and in North America, but very spotty coverage existed in the rest of the world. So we basically convened a process from 1996 to 1998 when we brought 70 law professors together from 15 Asian and Pacific nations to spend 1 month each summer learning the processes and exchanging views on how to build a curriculum on environmental law and how to teach it in a law faculty. We worked with some of the real pioneers in environmental law, Tony Aposa from the Philippines, who won the Supreme Court rulings in that nation for the right to the environment. Some of the great leaders from Indonesia and China came to this conference, this symposia of these law professors. And we ended up creating 2 books that were then used in other regions, such as Costa Rica, to create a model for how environmental law should be developed in other parts of the world. During this time in 1990, the UN had decided to convene a preparatory committee for the Earth Summit in Rio. I joined Wolfgang Berhenne and Parvez Hassan in attending the Rio Earth Summit and took on the task for IUCN from 1990 to about 1993 to edit all the proceedings of the Earth Summit in 6 volumes. IUCN was the only organization to produce the proceedings for libraries. This was in the days before we had electronic dissemination of knowledge, before the documents would be put online automatically as they emerged. And so we created the historical archive for this very important meeting. The meeting produced the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the first statement of principles, really, concurrent with those we had in the Earth Charter, but one that had come out of the dialogue of states. It also produced Agenda 21. And in Chapter 8 of Agenda 21, the states had called upon all nations to build up environmental legislation around the world and build up the teaching of environmental law. And Chapter 8 called upon institutions to help build capacity for the teaching of environmental law. Because if you're not going to teach the field, no one will ever understand it or practice it. It won't be in the courts, in the agencies. And so it was out of this mission that the Commission on Environmental Law decided to constitute a planning group to create an IUCN Academy of Environmental Law, a consortium of the law schools of the world that teach environmental law to exchange views with each other and build up a further teaching of environmental law, to do research on environmental law, to find what's wrong with it and find ways to enhance it. And so we created this teaching academy. We held our first meeting in the Shanghai with Shanghai Jiaotong University in China. And we chose as our model the oldest written character for the law, Fa, which has as its theme an environmental theme. You have a mystical creature in this pictogram who is a creature with a great horn, and he is judging man, the symbol of a man. The act of judging in this ancient Chinese pictogram is the act of water running downhill. And as water runs downhill, it finds the level, the balance, the even space for judgment. And so we thought this was really a wonderful model for how humans look at nature. It's not like the Greco-Roman model of the scales of justice, which also show even-handedness and balance, but it has the same idea. It captures the essence of this in a natural setting. So we adopted this pictogram as the logo for the Academy. And the Academy has now grown and has over 100 universities building up that work which we began at the University